Cantilena is a women's chorale based here in Arlington, Massachusetts. In 2019, under the musical direction of Dr. Jennifer Kane, Cantilena wanted to elevate the voices of women who have been sounding the climate crisis alarm, "Our house is on fire," for decades. Finding no such work in the choral canon, Cantilena commissioned Dr. Giselle Wyers to write a work for us, highlighting both how we see ourselves in relation to nature, as well as incorporating the urgent call to take action to mitigate the climate crisis. We were preparing to bring the words of Greta Thunberg to the public in this format, and to premiere the work Fire in the Garden, a Climate Change Trilogy, at the celebration of the 50th anniversary of Earth Day during the 2020 EcoWeek here in Arlington. Then in March of 2020, as you know, we were swept into the midst of a global pandemic. Cantilena and other performing arts organizations began what became a long hiatus from holding in-person rehearsals and performances. EcoWeek 2020 became yet another event that reflected a world out of balance. Believing that our message, the urgent call to action, could not be postponed until we could safely rehearse and perform in person, Cantilena, in the fall of 2021, under less than ideal conditions, gave a live-streamed performance of Fire in the Garden to a remote audience. This Earth Day, 2022, the chorus is pleased finally to be able to share with you Dr. Wyers' work, along with a 20-minute interview with the composer, as she discusses her creative process with Cantilena's Fall 2021 Music Director, Dr. Allegra Martin. You can find a link to the entire December 2021 concert program at our website, cantilena.org/concerts. There, you can read Dr. Wyers' program notes, as well as the original texts from which the composer selected excerpts for the 15-minute piece. We are pleased to announce that Cantilena is returning to live in-person performances at the First Parish Unitarian Universalist of Arlington this spring. We invite you, the Arlington community, to our concert entitled Ripple Effect, Songs for Expanding Community on Sunday, May 15th at 4 p.m. You can find more about the chorus, the concert program, and our admission policy on our website, cantilena.org. The women of Cantilena wish to extend special thanks to Jennifer Kane, who launched the project with Giselle Wyers, to the Mass Cultural Council for partially supporting the project with a 2020 grant award that sustained us through the spring of 2020, and to all of our donors and volunteers who gave their support in funds and time to make this commissioned work possible. In addition, Cantilena thanks the organizers of EcoWeek. We hope we can bring Fire in the Garden back as a performance under more favorable circumstances in the near future, and that choruses around the world are bringing this urgent call to action to their communities.
According to the science we have right, Giselle, thank you so much for joining me to talk about your piece, Fire in the Garden. It's really nice to be meeting you on Zoom. I was wondering, to start, if you could give us a little background about you as a composer. When did you start composing? Where and who are you working with now? And do you have any exciting projects coming up?
Sure. Well, thank you, Allegra, for this invitation, and to Cantilena Women's Chorale for taking this project on. I'm really excited to hear the premiere of the piece. So I am primarily a choral conductor, but I do love composing choral music, and have for many years been engaged in different projects with choruses around the United States and abroad, and just kind of using that as really a deepening of the artistic work that I can do and the challenges that I can take on. In terms of my background, I guess it was in high school that I started to write music. I was a pianist and a singer, and enjoyed improvising. I was not intimidated by that, luckily, and would spend time just sort of venting or decompressing from my day at the piano. Starting out a lot with sort of new agey, lighter kinds of music or folk music as an inspiration. But by the time I got into my first job as a conductor at Boise State University, I wanted to write something for my choir. And I thought, I want to give this a try. And based just on the theory skills that I'd picked up in college and understanding a lot about choral music from the perspective of a conductor, I decided to give it a try and had some early successes and decided to continue. In fact, I actually had a piece done in Boston early on in my career that kind of buoyed up my excitement, the Cambridge Madrigal Singers at the time.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I used to sing with them a long, long, long time ago.
Okay, wonderful. Ray Farner is great. So
yes.
yeah.
So do you have
and projects?
Yeah, where and you're
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, currently at the where you're working?
University of Washington.
Yeah.
And projects right now, I'm working on a piece for the Greater Seattle Choral Consortium, which is a group of about 40 choirs that have come together through Consortio, the sponsoring organization that's in Minneapolis, to create a group commission where each choir puts in a little bit into the hat. And I'm writing a piece called Join in Gathering, which is really intended to celebrate the return to in-person singing, moving away from the sadness of last year and celebrating being together again.
Oh, that's fabulous.
Yeah.
And I also understand, is that the group composition work that you're writing on? You also were involved in something involving group composition. Can you describe what that is?
Yeah, it was really tricky because it was over Zoom, but I was asked by Angela Casper at Western Washington University to co-teach this course with 3 of her choirs there on Zoom, figuring out how can we write a piece really using consensus to come to decisions about text and harmony and texture and the length of the piece and what should the message of the piece be. So it was a month and a half project. It took us a while to pull it all together, but we ended up creating 3 new original compositions with the students over Zoom.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
that's really fabulous.
Cool.
What a great use of Zoom.
Yeah.
So for this piece, Fire in the Garden, can you talk a little bit about the genesis of this piece and how your relationship with Cantilena's previous director, Jennifer Kane, kind of led to this commission?
Yeah, it was a really lucky experience. I believe I had been recommended by another composer who had worked with Jennifer, and Jennifer was familiar with some of my music, some of the larger known pieces like I Go Among Trees or The Waking, and those both happened to be from a set about the environment, 3 poems for the earth that I had created many years ago. And she was thinking about a project with Cantilena and discussing it with her board, I believe, and many people weighed in with the ideas of theme and thoughts for that. But the first step was meeting her. So we were both going to be at the Minneapolis National Conference, I believe in 2017, and we sat down and had coffee and just got to know each other as fellow female conductors in the field and talked about this possibility for a collaboration. And then I think she went back and spoke to the board and the choir and began to come up with an idea for a grant application that led to a specific mission and task. And at that point, I was brought on board.
And so did Cantilena ask you specifically to write an environmental piece?
Yes, and in fact, more specifically, climate change and female poets, female identifying poets.
And did they ask you to look at any poets and speakers in particular, or what was your process of finding and collecting those texts?
So this was an arduous and very inspiring process because I was, of course, familiar with the words of Al Gore. I was familiar with Chief Seattle as a great Native American poet and leader. And, his words resonating over many, many years now in the past. But I had never tried to specifically look into what female writers were saying, and specifically the climate crisis. So what I found was a big challenge was that many poems talk about the environment. Many poems even maybe talk about the degradation or the loss of habitat in the environment, but fewer are actually discussing climate crisis in particular. And if they are, they might be using a language that is either very scientific and technical. Let's say if we're looking at a speech that someone has given at a climate summit, and prose is always possible, right? You don't always have to use poetry. So it might be quite scientific, or it might be over the top negative to the point where if you are going to look at an issue, I think you have a responsibility as a composer to create a space for people to contemplate difficult things without feeling despair to the point of inaction. The hope here is actually that we can do something and make things better. So so it took quite a long time. And I looked at many, many poets, but Jennifer and all of her colleagues were definitely offering me ideas. I was not alone in this process, and that made it so much better, especially because I was working in the summer. And that can be a very isolating, quiet time in the life of a conductor and a composer anyway. So
yeah. Now the texts you ended up with here, we have Greta Thunberg, Denise Levertov, together with a Bible verse, and then Barbara Deming plus Hildegard of Bingen. So can you talk kind of about how you are structuring the piece and what you sort of think each movement sort of represents for you emotionally?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I really wanted to create kind of a journey or an arc that people could enter into, discover different aspects of the climate crisis and the way it makes us feel, but ultimately come out of the 12 to 15 minutes of music with a feeling of hope. And so I decided, after so many different drafts, of course, of text, but I did decide to start with the words of Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish activist who is, to this day, going to all of the summits and protesting and speaking. I like the directness of her voice. I like the fact that she, although young, is strong. And I think even one of the titles of her book talks about that, I don't know if she says, I don't remember what it is, but something that you don't have to be a huge presence in the world in order to do big things. So we do need to feel the urgency of this issue. And Greta Thunberg brings it up from the second you start with this text. So our house is on fire.
Yeah.
I am here to say our house is on fire. I mean, I thought that would be a very dramatic way to start a piece, and almost like a calling out or even crying out that I choose to use even before the piano comes in. So it's just the choir crying out. By the time we get to the end of that poem, though, it's not really a poem, but I turned it into a poem. She's talking about we must have hope, but we can only have hope through action. Then hope will come. And then this leads us into maybe a place of being more open. Because I think part of what happens when we think about climate crisis is that there's a tendency to shut down and just feel so overwhelmed that we don't even know where to start.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, so, thinking of hope, thinking of small actions we can take. The second movement is the center of the piece. And I really wanted to slow down, take the listener inward with a much more spare kind of setting from Denise Levertov, who can utter, and talking about really the poignance and the beauty of all of those living creatures that are degraded by our actions, forcing us to look at the issue, but also through a perspective of heartfelt care for the planet. And her text was so direct to me. It just went right into my soul. I just thought we must set this text. And so she does also talk about shame, which I think is difficult, but it is something that, again, people, especially the younger generations, when they look at climate crisis, they do look to the boomers and say, hey, what could you have done differently?
Yeah.
And even if you did everything right, what is the global shame of what we are now doing? And yet, can things become better because of that confrontation? So I loved that text. And then at the very end of the piece, I threw in this Bible verse that I really enjoyed because it talks about sort of, look, we might be in a decent place now, but what happens when things get even worse?
Mhm.
So this text is, for if we do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry? And I just thought that was a great way to end that contemplation. Like, wow, we really do need to look at this. And then the
I
final
really
movement.
love that movement. I just want to say,
Oh, good.
I think it's my favorite. It is always getting stuck in my head, and usually the music that gets stuck in my head is whatever I've rehearsed most recently.
Mhm.
But it'll be like 5 or 6 days later, and I'll be like, oh, movement 2 is stuck in my head again.
I
Yeah.
did really try to make it very spare and
Yeah,
very
it's very
quiet.
beautiful. I'm eager for everybody to hear it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So then that third movement is a prayer for the earth. And here I wanted to maybe take a like periscope backwards, or whatever the word would be when you go kind of wider lens, and
Zoom out.
Thank you. Zoom.
Considering what we're on. Yeah.
And also to bring maybe a female voice from the past. So using Hildegard, 12th century abbess and poet and mystic and composer, the first female composer that we have written music from, and to really let her be almost like a spiritual guide for us. We're looking back at a time when this crisis hadn't occurred yet, and wondering about how verdant it must have been, the planet, right? But then also her maybe creating some kind of a prayer or even a chant, which is how I said it with the singers, to hypnotize us into this hope that we will be okay and we will emerge. And then the Barbara Deming poem, which is most of the text of that movement, just a benediction, really a benediction, and a heartfelt plea to come out the other side with a resolution, which ultimately, as all the radio people keep saying lately, existential crisis. We're hearing this a lot. And I like that, but I also feel like, you know what? It's not existential to the point where we can't do anything about it. We
Right.
can.
Yeah. I think you did a really wonderful job of taking as you say, a topic that often makes people sort of freeze in fear, and it's not at all a kind of terrifying piece. It is very hopeful. So yeah, you had a really light touch on the mood, and it works really well, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah. So one question that came from one of our singers is it difficult to put music to text that is plain speech instead of poetry or lyrics written to become a song? How do you create a flow to the music when you have text that does not rhyme?
Yeah, that's a big one. And it's something that really works best if you read aloud the passage and try to hear what inherent rhythms might be present in the speech. For instance, the poem in the second movement, who can utter the poignance of all that is constantly threatened, degraded, right? It just has this kind of flow that's already present. In some poetry, we have ideas that are stimulating, but they aren't necessarily melodious. It does seem like some poems have this flow, and others can be a lot choppier, or just maybe they have more of a conversational style, a speech-like style, which is very popular in modern poetry, but doesn't always necessarily wed itself to singing. We're trying to think of sung phrases. We're trying to think of textures where all the text can fit together beautifully. So that's something that I always look at by speaking out loud. Sometimes it can work to just slow down the meter of the spoken speech, but sometimes it's really just not fitting. And then we also have prose as an option. And if we're looking at a speech, for instance, Greta Thunberg writings or speeches, it might simply be a matter of paring down what you had. So everything might still work, but end up feeling too long. And so in that case, I'm looking again for almost turning the prose into a poem. And what I will do is I'll put it on a computer spreadsheet, like a Word doc, and I'll try to create what look like lines of poetry from the prose. And that seems to work pretty well in most contexts.
Cool.
Yeah.
As a follow-up to that question, one of our members asked, said that she had had a conversation with Jennifer Kane, the former music director of Cantilena, and had learned that there were a number of women activists from around the world that you had wanted to include, but whose written or spoken material would have been difficult as a composition for chorus. So I think you already addressed this, but can you talk about who some of those people were that you were attracted to and wanted to include, but for one reason or another, it didn't just quite fit?
Yeah, I can give examples, but only to say that this is in no way a criticism of those poets. There are always, so many people are so busy. And so an example might be Jane Goodall. We had some close contact with her staff and her supporters. We were starting a discussion about certain texts from speeches that she had given, and they were open to ideas, but ultimately I just wasn't hearing back. So I would send, a clump of texts that seemed useful and wait for even a month maybe and be sending reminders. So sometimes it's just a matter that the person is a little bit too high profile. Maybe it's harder to get access to them. Whereas Greta Thunberg also took a long time, and I had given up fairly, and then realized that I could reach her through a different route. And I was able to find someone, not her, but somebody who said, oh, well, I thought everybody already knew that all of her speeches, she's given permission to be used. And I thought, well, I didn't know that, but thank you. So there's an example. I would give other examples of like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Barbara Kingsolver is a voice that I would love to set. But maybe at times it was like, it would either be a proclamation. There would be maybe 3 or 4 sentences that would be proclaiming something really important, but it didn't necessarily create enough of a flow of narrative. And I feel like in all 3 of the movements, I ended up creating a feeling of a flow of ideas that was really compelling and important. And then there are other poets who have very strong feelings about music setting. The musical settings aren't always advantageous. Some poets believe that it can dilute the impact or the message, that they believe that their work stands on its own. It would be sort of like a painter if you suddenly took their painting and thought that you needed to do a whole lot of extra things to it. And examples of that would be Mary Oliver. Joy Harjo was interested in collaboration, but preferred that I set the entire text, which would have been 3 pages of words. so these are all examples of where, we had these close calls. Maybe it could have worked out. Maybe if we'd had more time, maybe if the piece were longer, those things might have changed the whole profile.
I understand. And so as one last question, do you have a composer, particularly perhaps a woman composer who has been a particularly big influence on you?
Yeah, I was lucky to have this question sent to me in advance, because I think that I will share that I have a lot of interests in music that go beyond classical music. And for years, I always kind of separated that part of myself from my professional identity. One of the things I really like about some of the conversations that are being had in the world right now are about the importance of diversification of our musics, and the people that get to speak and the people that we honor through music. And with that in mind, I really want to say Joni Mitchell, because I think she is really one of the best songwriters of all time, really, that we've ever had. And I've listened to all of her music. I know it. I have kind of pretty encyclopedic knowledge of Joni Mitchell. And I love her, the way she has this speech phrases that roll easily off the voice. It's very conversational. I love her use of harmony, her use of alternate tunings on the guitar, the kinds of textures and orchestrations that she's created to enhance some of her albums. So she's a big one. And the other I really want to say is Meredith Monk. She's this true pioneer, not just as a female composer, but in the minimalist vein, in the whole vein of creating site-specific projects that could take place under a bridge as well as in the concert hall. Her passion for the environment and her Buddhist kind of faith and all those things kind of draw me into really examining her music and admiring her.
Those are very inspiring answers. Thank you for sharing.
Sure.
And thank you for this conversation today.
Yeah, thank you. I've had a chance to hear your rehearsal, and I want to tell everyone who's listening to get out there to that concert, because it's going to be a really beautiful event.
We agree, and it's going to be available to everybody because it will be live streamed. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you again. Take care.